Welcome everyone to the Jewish Democratic Council of America's program today, The Changing Politics of Gun Safety. My name is Joel Breitkoff, and as a JDCA board member and outreach vice chair, I want to thank you for joining us both for today's program and also for joining together hand in hand in the crucial fight to enact common sense gun laws that save lives. Advancing gun safety reform is as an indelible priority to the Jewish community. Too many of our communities have been ravaged by the scourge of gun violence in America, from Parkland, Florida to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to the gun-related deaths occurring in communities across the country every day. More than 25,000 Americans have already been killed by gun violence in 2023, and that number continues to grow day by day. As Jewish Democrats, we say enough is enough. We've urged members of Congress to pass universal background checks, an assault weapons ban, and have joined coalitions to push for gun violence prevention measures at the state and local levels. We are here today to get involved, to learn, and to make a difference. At the forefront of this effort is Giffords, the organization dedicated to saving lives from gun violence. Founded in the wake of the tragic Sandy Hook massacre and the culmination of 20 years of hard work from preceding gun safety organizations, Giffords has turned outrage into action, researching and enacting life-saving solutions to gun violence. In the past 10 years, the politics of gun safety have shifted, and the movement to end gun violence has matured to become more effective. Today, we are joined by two experts from Giffords and Congressman Jamie Raskin, who will all share with us their political, legal, and policy expertise in the fight for gun safety, as well as their lived experiences, the type of experiences that tragically more and more Americans must live with every year. To introduce today's guests, I'm delighted to welcome JDCA board member and outreach committee chair, Deborah Stein. Deborah?
Thank you, Joel. We're honored to be joined by three experts in the field today: Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, Congressman Jamie Raskin, and Giffords Executive Director, Peter Ambler. Unfortunately, gun violence prevention advocate, Catherine Fleischer, is unable to join us today, and we look forward to her joining us at a future time. Former Arizona Congresswoman Gabby Giffords represented her district from 2006 to 2012. In 2011, at a Congress on Your Corner constituent event in Tucson, Gabby was shot in the head by a gunman who killed 6 people and injured 12 others. After a miraculous recovery, Gabby stepped down from Congress, and in 2013, after the tragic mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut, Gabby co-founded the organization today known as Giffords. Over the past several years, the organization has been a leader in the national gun safety movement, making gun safety a kitchen table issue for voters. Peter Ambler serves as the executive director of Giffords, which he co-founded with Congresswoman Giffords and her husband, Senator Mark Kelly. As executive director, Peter has guided the growth of the organization from a startup in Washington, D.C., to a national group with offices and staff across the country. To introduce our final speaker, I'd like to welcome JDCA's Vice Chair, Barbara Goldberg-Goldman. Barbara?
Deborah, thank you so much, and thank you for your stellar work on outreach. You're a miracle for us, so thank you very, very much. I believe that Congressman Raskin was on the floor, so I'm not sure he's joining us yet. I'm more than happy to introduce him now, but I think you probably might want to jump and let our second speaker go ahead, and then we can get right back to Jamie, because I know I talked with him last week. He's very anxious to be on this call. He has been a champion in gun safety for decades. So, Bobby, I'm going to ask you if that's okay if we sort of reverse our order here a little bit. Can we do that? Terrific. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Haley Seufer right now, who will get our conversation going. And as soon as Congressman Raskin is available and he's off the floor, we'll go back to the introduction. Haley?
Great. Thank you, Barbara. We are so thrilled to be joined today by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and Peter Ambler of Giffords. We will start with you, Gabby. June marked the one-year anniversary of the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first meaningful piece of gun safety legislation to pass in 30 years. Although it was a big accomplishment, there's still so much more to be done. Are you optimistic about further meaningful change on this issue?
I'm optimistic. It will be a long, hard haul, but I'm optimistic.
Great. We're so happy to hear it, and we share your optimism. So, Peter, what are the biggest changes that we have seen in the gun violence prevention movement since you first joined this work? And how has the movement matured? What have been the biggest victories?
That's a great question, Haley. I mean, I think an example of a change is a conversation like this, right? Core partnerships like the one between us and the council didn't exist a decade ago. And today we're part of a big, vibrant coalition that has the majority support for safer gun laws. And that's why you're starting to see success. Gabby and I talk a lot about the fact that, when I worked in Congress for a decade, Gabby served in Congress for many years. There wasn't a single time when an organization like ours ever contacted one of us to lobby us on gun safety, right? Meanwhile, the NRA is sort of in and out of your offices. So but in 2013, when I joined Gabby to say enough is enough of the venality, extremism, corruption, influence of the NRA, enough of the NRA literally writing our nation's gun laws, that changed. And what's happened over the past decade is that in many ways, we have overcome their influence. So today, rather than policymakers not having access to an organization like ours, we out-lobby the NRA. Today, instead of candidates cowering in fear at big investments that the NRA may be making in various races across the country, today we outspend the NRA and we're winning the political argument. So you see that in campaigns across the country, folks are more likely to wear the NRA F grade rather than tout an NRA endorsement. And just generally, there are clearly more people on the side of Giffords and the gun safety movement than there are on the side of the NRA.
Thank you. And Gabby, back to you. These tragedies are happening again and again. Tragically, more than we can even remember and count, but we all have been impacted. Do you ever want to give up in this work to end gun violence?
No way, Jose. Move ahead to not look back. I hope others are inspired to keep moving forward no matter what.
Thank you. Peter, as we've mentioned before, last year, Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And this was the first time that a bill had been passed and signed into law in over 30 years. Can you tell us all what reforms were included in this legislation and what was not included, where we still need to ensure that we pass gun safety measures?
Absolutely. It was a really important moment. I think about the difference between Sandy Hook and the reaction to that and the reaction to Uvalde, right? I worked with Gabby after Sandy Hook. We launched Giffords. We clawed, we fought, we lobbied, we advocated, we campaigned across the country for months and months on end, only to see our bill, the Manchin-Toomey background checks bill, get filibustered then. 10 years later, movement building is a different story. After passing 550 bills at the state, after winning thousands of races across the country, educating millions of Americans, we're able, a month to the day after the tragic shooting in Uvalde, we're able to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act with the support of 15 Republican senators and other Republicans in the House. It was a bipartisan achievement. What did it include? Some very important things: enhanced background checks for younger Americans, the nation's first anti-gun trafficking statute. We worked to close the boyfriend loophole and make sure that we're keeping guns out of the hands of abusive dating partners. We passed critical resources for the implementation of red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders, which allow members of a community to go to an individual in crisis and temporarily restrain their access to a gun, a policy that's been shown to be extremely effective when implemented. And we passed about $250 million in support for violence intervention measures. So it was, it's real gun safety policy that's going to have an impact in saving lives. It doesn't include everything that we need, right? We're still seeking out comprehensive reform. Universal background checks was not included, nor was legislation addressing assault weapons. But we did just have an executive order from President Biden that expanded background checks closer to universal than we've ever been in the past. So we look for every possible way that we can to make progress on this issue.
Thank you so much. We have been joined by Congressman Raskin, and I'm going to turn it over to JDCA's Vice Chair, Barbara Goldberg-Goldman, to introduce them. And we're going to come back to you, Gabby and Peter, after the Congressman speaks. Barbara.
Haley, thank you so much. And Congressman Raskin, we know how busy you are, and we realize that your schedule is very, very tight. And we want to thank you profusely for making time for us about an issue that I know goes right to your soul and your heart. I'm delighted to be able to introduce you. We in Maryland have known that you are a star and not a rising star, even though when you first got into Congress, people were saying that you would be a rising star. Well, we already knew that you were a star, representing the 8th Congressional District of Maryland. I'm proud to be a resident there. You've really been a constant champion for gun safety. You've introduced gun safety measures in Congress, including the Handgun Purchaser Licensing Act and the Stop Home Manufacture of Ghost Guns Act of 2020. So I'm going to just turn it over to you because we want to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, dear Barbara, and for your friendship and your great activism. And thanks for everybody at Giffords and also the JDCA. You guys are my brothers and sisters in this struggle. I spoke yesterday to Melissa Alexander, who is a woman you may have read about in the Washington Post. That's how she came to my attention. But her son was in the mass shooting at the school in Tennessee, and he's a lifelong Republican, very conservative. But she wanted something to be done, and she began to investigate and explore. And of course, she ran into a brick wall of opposition for Republicans, but she's kept organizing. And I reached out to her, and we spoke on the phone, and we're getting together in Washington this week. She says, she's been in touch with moderate Republicans, independents across the country who are in an uproar about gun violence. And I just got back, Barbara, from a 10-state political tour this summer where I was out campaigning for fellow Democrats and speaking at state and county party dinners and stuff. And gun violence is foremost in people's minds, along with climate change and with the assault on women's rights and abortion. But everywhere I went, people were talking about gun violence and how life is becoming unlivable in so many communities in so many parts of the country. The pathway forward, I believe, is reaching out to all of the Republicans and moderates, empowering them first to speak out in the Republican Party, to create the conflict and the antagonism against the right-wing NRA forces and the more extreme gun groups that have risen up over the last year or two. And then we'll begin to peel a bunch of these people off. But I think that in terms of meaningful legislative action in the country, we have got to defeat, and luckily we can defeat, the argument that the meaning of the Second Amendment is that the people have the right to overthrow the government and to engage in insurrection. This argument, which we hear pretty much on a daily basis in the Judiciary Committee, the Oversight Committee on the floor, is completely refuted by the Constitution itself. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution, which says that Congress has the power to call forth the militias to suppress insurrections. The Republican Guarantee Clause says we must guarantee to the people of the states a Republican form of government and help them put down domestic violence. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which is having its day in the sun right now, says anybody who's engaged in insurrection or rebellion as a public official, having sworn an oath to the Constitution, may never serve in federal or state office again. So we have an anti-insurrection Constitution. They say the Second Amendment has a provision in invisible ink, which says you've got a right to overthrow the government. But when we line up all of the parts of the Constitution and all of the Supreme Court precedents, and we showed them that there have been hundreds of prosecutions of January 6th insurrectionists, and none of their indictments have been quashed, none of their convictions have been reversed on the grounds that there's a right to overthrow the government, we can defeat that argument. And once we do, at that point, there's really nothing left for them to say. The only reason that they would oppose a universal violent criminal background check or a red flag law or a ban on assault weapons is they think it's worth it to have all of these civilian casualties just to give, just to give the NRA a victory, or just to say that we have fewer gun laws. The NRA used to be a reasonable, moderate, middle of the road gun safety organization. And of course, it was hijacked by Newt Gingrich and the gang in the 1970s and moved way to the right. And they tried to turn it into a cultural wedge issue. And they succeeded in doing that. Well, we've got to reclaim the center of this political dialogue and say the Constitution, even in its most conservative understanding offered by Justice Scalia, completely allows reasonable gun safety regulation. And the insurrectionist hypothesis is completely wrong. So I think that is changing rapidly. There's a lot of discussion about this on Capitol Hill, and there are more moderate Republicans who want to see some action, including Nancy Mace from South Carolina. So we're hearing from more and more Republicans that there's got to be a way forward on this. And I just want to salute and congratulate everybody on this call for the work you're doing. And please forgive me for having to get back to the Oversight Committee.
Jamie, thank you so very, very much. And we look forward to your Oversight Committee work. I'm going to turn it back over now to Haley.
And thank you, Haley. Thank you, Barbara. All best to you guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Well, we are grateful to the Congressman for his role as a leader in the House, every day fighting for the values that matter so much to Jewish Americans, including combating right-wing extremism and gun violence and defending our democracy. Congresswoman Giffords, back over to you. Things have not been easy for you, for all of us working in this space. What do you tell yourself when things get difficult?
Move ahead, to not look back. I hope others are inspired to keep moving forward no matter what.
Thank you. It is inspiring.
And I just want to say, picking up from where Gabby left off, Gabby has a saying, right? It's like, move ahead, don't look back. And that's certainly been true of her recovery from the gunshot wound, but it's also true of her leadership of the gun safety movement, right? Everybody here is engaged in political change in some way, shape, or form. We know if we're dwelling on our losses instead of learning from them, If we're not just sort of seeking that next win and the win after that, then we're not moving forward. And to have somebody who demonstrates the determination and resilience and courage of Gabby, it's just so important. And that's how we've been able to succeed as a movement. There have been no, silver bullets, right? It's been hard work, millions of advocates inspired by folks like Gabby rolling up their sleeves across the country, and then as Gabby would say, getting it done. Gabby also
Get it done.
Well, speaking of getting it done, now that at least one piece of legislation has passed, what's next? What are the most crucial gun safety measures that we can all be continuing to advocate for Congress to pass?
Yeah, there's always work to be done, Haley, and I think that's that's the critical question, right? I think, I'll just give an example. This is not like particularly like, glitzy. It's a little like wonky and nerdy, but I like to say I'm like 90% nerd. And so I mentioned that executive action that we can thank President Biden for, right? That we've been fighting for 10 years. And it expands background checks on an executive basis, and brings us closer to universal background checks than we've ever been. It'll take thousands and thousands of gun sales out of the shadows, put them into the regulated market. But there is this sort of federal process that we got to work through every step of the way. So what are we doing right now as an organization? We are organizing hundreds of thousands of people across the country to send supportive comments in to the Department of Justice so we can show that there's popular support for this rule. This used to be an area where the NRA would excel. Today, like, it's us that's organizing more people across the country and really leading the way. We'd love to sort of share opportunities for doing that with everybody listening today. I think we'll be able to follow up with you. And then, sort of set the sights on the next policy wins, which will occur at both the state and federal level. In California, we have a bill on the governor's desk, which will produce $1 billion over 5 years for gun violence prevention. That comes from an excise tax on the record profits that the gun industry is taking in right now. That's critical, life-saving measure. And in Congress, we continue to work towards universal background checks. We continue to work towards banning and addressing assault weapons. And like, this is something we do each and every day. And there's no other way to do it than, reaching out and convincing the next person.
Great, thank you. I want to tell our audience that we welcome your questions. We looks like we will have time to get to audience questions. So if you have them, please send them in to info@jewishdems.org. info@jewishdems.org. Okay, back to you, Gabby. What is your advice to people looking around their own communities and wondering what they can do to create change?
Be a leader, set an example, be passionate, be courageous, be your best.
Thank you. Peter, back to you. Gun violence is also a racial justice issue. And according to the Giffords Law Center, Black Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die by homicide. And we continue to experience tragic mass shootings perpetrated, some by white supremacists, just as we saw recently in Jacksonville. How has the gun violence prevention movement begun to address the disproportionate harm that gun violence has had on the Black community? And how are we working to combat the increasing danger of armed white supremacists?
Absolutely. Essentially what you're looking at here is a venal and corrupt and extreme industry that is making profits by putting guns on the street and putting guns into the hands of some of the most dangerous and extreme folks who will use those firearms to perpetrate unspeakable acts of violent hate. First of all, preventing gun violence writ large is critical to ensuring the safety of the communities who bear the disproportionate impact of gun violence. So if you have universal background checks, if you have other important measures, we need to ensure that those measures are in law, and then obviously also implemented and provided as critical tools for the communities who need them the most. Another key way that we address the disproportionate impact gun violence on communities of color is through our work at the Giffords Center for Violence Intervention. Over the past decade, we've not just sort of passed the 550 pieces of law at the state level, not just the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, but we've also opened over $1 billion worth of funding for violence intervention programs. And what are violence intervention programs? These are programs that are based and led at the community level that look at gun violence as what it is. It's a public health issue, that understand that violence is transmitted oftentimes from one person to another. And then if we have like strong community-led programs in place, that we can interrupt those cycles of gun violence that put us in a position where we have these sort of unspeakable dynamics in our society, where gun violence is the #1 cause of death for children. We also look for specific areas where gun violence disproportionately impacts people of color. The stand your ground laws that have been passed in some states, some red states across the country. Those laws, our research shows, lead to spikes in gun violence and have a sort of racist application in the courts. They're fundamentally wrong. And then, of course, you have these unspeakable acts that occur, way too much, like the shooting at the Top supermarket in Buffalo, like the shooting in my hometown of El Paso, Texas, where extreme racist gunmen use firearms to inflict racist mayhem and violence on these communities. It's terrorism, and too often it's the same politicians, it's the same people in the gun industry that are inflaming people's hatreds and making it much easier for them to buy guns. So we are working each and every day in Congress, in the states, in our courts, to hold those actors to account.
On a related note, anti-Semitism is at a record high in our country. And as we've discussed, we've seen an increasing number of deadly shootings motivated by white supremacy, including in the Jewish community. What can organizations like JDCA be doing as we prepare for the 2024 elections to make sure that we elect those who are best prepared to take on gun violence and extremism in the next Congress?
Absolutely, that's such a critical question, and it's something that is critical to Gabby, who I think, as everybody knows, was, I believe, the first Jewish congresswoman from Arizona, or Jewish woman congresswoman from Arizona, and whose faith and practice guides her advocacy. She, during the pandemic, she wasn't just sort of fighting gun violence. She was practicing for her bat mitzvah, and it's been a critical part to her recovery and also to her advocacy. And you're right that in the same way that you see racist gunmen target Black and brown communities, anti-Jewish sentiment has oftentimes happened at the barrel of a gun. And we've seen these terroristic attacks here in the US where Jewish Americans have been targeted. It's wrong. And I think it speaks to why this, partnership between Giffords and you is so critical. Because, when it comes to, again, the question of hate and firearms, it is too often the same actors who are inflaming hatred and who are, pushing guns as a solution to people's hate. And, I think more tactically, as we think about the next year and a half, where it seems like every election is the most important election, but that's certainly going to be true in 2024, where we'll have a election at the presidential level between somebody in President Joe Biden, who has taken on the gun lobby, who has done virtually everything within his power to pass safer gun laws, and who has identified, anti-Jewish hate as the scourge and problem that it is, and has, mobilized the assets of the Department of Justice to take it on. His opponent might be somebody who on both accounts has done the exact opposite. Sometimes the truth seems too crazy to be true, right? And I think something that we need to do in our communities across the country is ensure that every American is educated about the threat to our communities that comes from the deadly mix of hate and gun violence.
Absolutely. And I'm also so glad that you mentioned Congresswoman Giffords' bat mitzvah, because we haven't, I know it was in 2021, but we haven't had the chance to say Mazel Tov.
Mazel
So
tov.
Mazel Tov to you, Congresswoman, on your bat mitzvah. We celebrated with you on that meaningful day. I'm back to our gun violence discussion. We are now going to go to audience questions. And our first one comes from Eileen. And she asked a question which is somewhat related to what you mentioned, Peter, in terms of the importance of coalitions. You talked about the partnership between JDCA and Giffords on display today, but of course, this is just one piece of a much larger coalition. So if you could talk about the importance of coalitions in combating gun violence, and Eileen specifically was wondering about partnership with Brady United Against Gun Violence.
Yeah. The Gun Violence Coalition is really powerful. It works really, really well together. We have consistent sort of policy aims, and the ability to sort of each reach out to unique constituencies, right? So for example, you have a great organization like the moms doing the important sort of grassroots work out there in communities. You have a fantastic organization like the Community Justice Action Fund that lifts up solutions that are vital to Black and Brown communities. And you have like the work of an organization like Giffords, which Gabby runs, which has the ability to reach out to folks who maybe haven't felt comfortable in the gun violence prevention community in the past. But Gabby.
Oh, Bobos.
Oh yeah, Gabby likes to talk about the fact that she's not just a survivor of gun violence, but she's a gun owner too. And this isn't a debate or a coalition where it's gun owners versus non-gun owners, or even Democrats versus Republicans. This is, we like to say, this is an issue where there's no other side. We're all against gun violence here. And you can, work with an organization like Giffords to build our 100,000 plus person organization of American gun owners who are committed not to the NRA's agenda, but to Gabby's values of safety and responsibility, and work with any, number of other groups. And then, of course, we have, important partnerships with, the domestic violence prevention community, with the mental health community. We have worked with veterans. We have worked with survivors of many ilks across the country. This is I think somebody mentioned, this is a kitchen table issue, right? This is not an esoteric political issue. It's powerful politically because when parents, families, grandparents, others, come home at night and they sit around both the literal and proverbial kitchen table and they talk about the issues that are meaningful to them, gun violence is right there. And they talk about the nexus of gun violence with so many, so many other issues that they care about.
Great. We've talked a lot today about action that has been or could be taken by the federal government. But Judith from Arizona is asking that you speak about the importance of the role of local and state governments in reducing violence and how we could all push for action at the local and state level.
Yeah. I think it is almost always true that action happens and power is built at the local level before it's built nationally. And that's certainly been true of the gun violence prevention community. I mentioned the filibuster of Manchin Toomey, which is our first federal priority as an organization a decade ago. Gabby didn't give up after Manchin Toomey failed. Quite the contrary. She turned her attention to the states. And we have campaigned from coast to coast since then. And like I said, passed over 550 pieces of state legislation. And that's, demonstrated to the country, one, how we are able to pass gun violence prevention policies at the state level and do it on a bipartisan basis, but it's also shown their efficacy. And you're starting to see this sort of, tragic contrast between the states that have acted and the states that haven't. And many of us live in states where Giffords has been very successful passing safer gun laws. But and those states are, increasingly, especially on a per capita basis, safer places to live, right? There's this big red state like gun murder problem that we talk about. And I think, that is a contrast that is tragic in nature, right? Because, there's, a little over half of all Americans today, because of our state work, are covered by a universal background checks requirement. Those who aren't and who don't have the benefit of other gun laws, feel the impact of that inaction in the fact that their communities are less safe. So, I think
Florida.
it's easy to,
Florida.
Florida is a state where we've worked hard to sort of organize, and we've had some success after Parkland, but we've also seen Ron DeSantis, try to turn his state into like the, poster child for the, NRA's agenda in a desperate bid to be, nominated to run for president by the Republican Party. I don't think that's working. Yeah. And then the other thing on the local level, I'll say, is that in some states, we have the ability to work on a city by city basis, but there are some bad laws in many states that were passed decades ago by the NRA that preempt state action. And that's just some of the hardest things for communities to deal with when, you may be in a sort of red state where the legislature is less friendly, and there's a law that preempts local authority to act on gun safety. And that's just one of the many things that we need to change. But it's a great question.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Florida. We have a question from Florida, from former Florida State Rep and Speaker Pro Tem Elaine Bloom. She's asked, what can we do to stop open carry in Florida when Governor DeSantis pushes it next year?
So that's an excellent question. And Gabby would say, fight, 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 right? We are building. Yep. In the aftermath of Parkland, we launched Giffords, Florida, which was led in part by former Congresswoman Debbie McCarcel-Powell, who's now the Senate candidate against Rick Scott in Florida, which is really exciting to have a gun safety champion like her, a survivor of gun violence, running for U.S. Senate. but yes, open carry is one of the most terrifying and dangerous policies that's been introduced in this country by the gun lobby. It has a undermining effect on our democracy and free expression. It can obviously often be used to target and intimidate, communities of color and others, and it leaves everybody less safe. So it's also something that's pretty unpopular, and will work hand in glove with you and others across the state to defeat it.
Great. All right. Well, for our next question, it comes from Deborah. Deborah Tenenbaum. I will read the question. My husband was killed in 1999 in one of the first mass shootings in Atlanta, Georgia. I was left with 3 young children at the time, and I've never felt like I've done enough to fight gun violence. What can I do as an individual today to make a difference? And thank you, Deborah, for sharing this with us.
Deborah, thanks so much for sharing your story. I think, and Gabby and I have talked about this, that, on an issue as big and extensive and burdensome as the issue of gun violence, sometimes it feels like there's never enough that you can do, and that it's easier just to do nothing. But the truth is that if everybody just did something, get involved.
Denver.
Yeah, you don't have to be Gabby Giffords, right? Like, who travels the country extensively, just back from Denver, where she hosted a survivor town hall, helping survivors like you, Deborah, tell their stories. And we would love to work with you directly to tell your story in your community and across the country, if that's something you're comfortable with. But even just sort of raising your hand and saying, I'm going to be part of this virtual event. I'm going to be a meaningful part of an organization like the council or like Giffords. I'm going to give a little bit. I'm going to post on social media. I'm going to have those difficult conversations with my friends and neighbors.
Letters.
Sorry, yeah.
Letters.
Writing letters to elected officials. They read them.
Yes. One Monday.
Yeah, Gabby used to walk into her office every Monday, say like, what does the mail say? What do the phones say? I think this message is to Deborah and to everybody. If you're, angry about the state of gun violence in this country, that, it's the #1 cause of death for kids, but you're, unsure sort of how to get involved or how much you can do, don't put too much pressure on yourself. Just find a single authentic thing to do, and then if that feels right to you, then do the next thing. And that's how Gabby has led a movement, and it's how Gabby has recovered from her grievous injury. It's one step at a time, one word at a time, and there's no other way to do it.
Great. Well, we have a question from Amy, who also wants to get involved. And she's asking, where can we find out the politicians who are introducing bills for gun safety, for reducing violence? And I think a lot of us have this question: where are the resources for those who want to write the letters and want to follow what individuals are doing in Congress about this issue? Absolutely.
You go to Giffords.org. Giffords, not Gifford, Giffords.org, and it is one of the most extensive resources on everything that's happening vis-a-vis the problem of and solutions to gun violence. So for example, you can learn about all the different policies that we're fighting to put into effect. You can learn about what the politicians are doing, whether right or wrong, on the issue. We have our champions, we have the folks that we're working to defeat. You can find out what's happening in your state. So if you're in Florida, you can go to the Giffords Florida website. If you're in Georgia, you can go to the Giffords Georgia website. You can learn about what the laws are, what they should be, who we're working with, and how to take action.
Great. And as we look at the role of Congress and the reality that gun safety legislation had not passed in 30 years until we had a Democrat in the White House and a Democratic controlled House and Senate last year. How do we think about this issue in the context of the 2024 election and what we can all do to elect those who would pass meaningful gun safety measures?
Absolutely. Gun safety is going to be on the ballot in 2024. There is no doubt about it. And it's also going to be an issue that will be critical to President Biden's reelection efforts and to our ability to keep the Senate and win back the House. It is a bread and butter concern for the core parts of our coalition. So if you want to sort of talk about what's an issue that activates young people, that activates sort of base Democratic voters, gun safety is at the top of that list. If you want to talk about an issue that is critical to persuading sort of more moderate voters who may be on the fence, gun safety is at the top of that issue. And if you look at the battlegrounds, right, all across the country, Michigan being a great example, that's an issue. That's a state where we just took back the legislature and passed
Minnesota.
Minnesota passed universal background checks there. And then you've got the sort of suburban heavy Sunbelt states like Georgia and Arizona, where guns is a real motivating issue for the sort of like swing voters. And if you look at the sort of some of the House seats that are up for grabs, and it could determine the leadership of the House of Representatives next Congress, and therefore our ability to pursue real meaningful change. That majority goes through some seats that where guns is a very important issue for us, right? Because like those suburban areas like that used to be more Republican and more conservative have flipped in large part because of the gun safety issue and other issues like choice, right? Where folks are, they're a little bit more, moderate on some economic issues perhaps, but they think, repealing Roe v. Wade, overturning Roe v. Wade, they think that the gun lobby's corrupt coalition with some Republican lawmakers are just a step too far for them to be able to support Republicans. And if we're talking about the threat of gun violence and the fact that so many of our Democratic candidates are going to be there to do something about it, that is critical to winning the presidency, getting Joe Biden reelected, and winning back the House as well. And Gabby, you're going to be hitting the campaign trail, right?
Yeah. Denver, LA, Michigan, Chicago.
Gabby is a warrior on the campaign trail, and I'm sure you'll all have an opportunity to see her out there as we continue to fight for safer gun laws and for our very democracy itself.
We look forward to it and working with you all. Our last question is, this is a difficult issue. It's an issue where there has not been much progress. We're celebrating a bill that frankly was good, but not even good enough. It's the first bill to pass in 30 years. Change has been incremental in this space, and it is so desperately needed. So what gives you the hope to keep fighting in this space? What gives you hope that we can create real change in the future?
I know what
want-
gives. Sorry, go ahead, Gabby.
I want to make the world a better place.
And I mean, Gabby Giffords gives me hope, right? Someone who can pick themselves up.
What, and chicken.
In the months after being shot, those were the only words that Gabby could say. And now she is traveling the country, giving speeches, lobbying legislators, putting the tight squeeze on folks. I mean, she does very, very effectively. I think it's Gabby's courage. And maybe, Gabby, do you want to speak a little bit about the courage that stopping gun violence takes?
Stopping gun violence takes courage. The courage to do what's right. The courage to do ideas. You see, great courage when my life is on the line. Now is the time to come together. Be responsible. Democrat, Republican, independent. We must never stop fighting. Fight, fight, fight. Be bold. Be courageous. A nation counting on you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for your inspiring leadership, your commitment to this issue. And Gabby, we are with you in this fight. And we're grateful for you and the role you're playing and hitting the campaign trail, and we'll be with you. We want to thank everyone for joining the conversation today on this critically important issue. And I especially want to thank our speakers, Gabby Giffords, Congressman Jamie Raskin, and Giffords Executive Director, Peter Ambler. I'm glad that we had questions about how to get involved and how to get resources on this issue. And we will send as follow-up to everyone more information about Giffords. JDCA is proud to be a partner in this fight and to work hand in hand with Giffords and elected leaders like Congressman Raskin to ensure that we will have a future free from the epidemic of gun violence that has plagued our communities. So to tell us how you can take action with JDCA, I want to call in JDCA's Senior Director of Programming and Public Engagement, Bobby Saferstein, to wrap up. Bobby.
Thank you, Haley.
Thank you, Haley, and thank you to, of course, all of our speakers and all of you at home for joining us for today's discussion on discussing the changing politics of gun safety and the movement to end gun violence. In just a few days, Jews everywhere enter a period of time known as the Yamim Noraim, or Days of Awe, beginning with celebrations for Rosh Hashanah, the new year, and culminating with our holiest day, Yom Kippur. It's a time of deep reflection when we look inwards and outwards to contemplate who we are, what have we accomplished, and what more can we do. It's easy to feel helpless and hopeless when confronted with the scourge of gun violence in the United States. But as we've heard today, there is hope, and we're proud of just how far gun safety legislation has come. We know it's not enough, and we must and can do more. As Jews, we have a responsibility to work towards a safer, just, and more equitable world for all. And here at JDCA, we turn that responsibility into collective action. To join us in this work, please visit jewishdemocrats.org and help us urge Congress to enact universal background checks and reauthorize the assault weapons ban by signing our 2 calls to action. While on jewishdemocrats.org, go ahead and subscribe to our email list to stay current on our upcoming events and opportunities, including our next event on Tuesday, October 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern, when we'll be joined by political commentator Brian Tyler Cohn and other special guests to discuss the 2024 general election almost 1 year out. You can sign up at the link in the chat. We also hope you'll join one of JDCA's local chapters and affiliates made up of passionate grassroots volunteers. And we encourage you to support JDCA and programs like this by making a financial contribution and by becoming a JDCA member to gain access to exclusive briefings throughout the year. And of course, please visit giffords.org to join their efforts to prevent gun violence. Thank you again for joining us today. Wishing each of you a Shana Tova Tikatevu V'Techatemu, a happy, healthy, and action-oriented new year from all of us at JDCA. See you soon.
you.